Mark Johnson sat in his patrol car, his eyes fixed on the smartphone screen. The video showed a peaceful protest, with citizens marching and holding signs. Their faces reflected frustration and anger towards police brutality. Mark sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. After years on the force, he'd seen his share of challenges in this divided community. As he watched, Mark couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. He understood the protesters' concerns, but he also felt defensive of his profession. The job had changed so much over the years, and the tension between law enforcement and the community seemed to be at an all-time high. His thoughts were interrupted by the roar of an engine. A car sped past him, well above the speed limit. Mark's instincts kicked in immediately. He turned on his siren and lights, pulling out onto the road to pursue the vehicle. As he followed the speeding car, memories of past incidents flashed through his mind. Similar situations had escalated quickly, leading to tense confrontations. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He hoped this wouldn't be another such case. The speeding car finally pulled over. Mark parked behind it and took a deep breath before stepping out of his patrol car. He approached the vehicle cautiously, one hand resting near his holster out of habit. As he got closer, Mark could see the driver clearly. It was a young African-American man, his face etched with fear. In the back seat, a woman was visibly in pain, her face contorted. "License and registration, please," Mark said, his voice firm but not aggressive. The driver fumbled with his wallet, his hands shaking. "Officer, please, my wife. She's in labor. We need to get to the hospital." Mark looked at the woman in the back seat again. Her breathing was labored, and she was clutching her swollen belly. The situation was clear, but years of training and experience made Mark hesitate. He'd seen people lie to get out of tickets before, but this seemed genuine. The tension in the air was palpable. Mark could see the fear in the young man's eyes, fear that went beyond just being pulled over. It was the fear of a black man confronted by a white police officer, a fear born from years of systemic racism and publicized incidents of police brutality. Mark knew he had a decision to make, one that could potentially change lives. Mark took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "Sir, can you explain why you were speeding?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. The driver, Jordan Smith, was visibly shaken. "Officer, I'm sorry, I know I was going too fast. But my wife, Lisa, she's in labor. We need to get to St. Mary's Hospital right away. Please, we don't have much time." Mark glanced at the woman in the back seat again. Lisa was clearly in pain, her face contorted as she breathed heavily. The situation seemed genuine, but years on the force had made Mark cautious. "How far apart are the contractions?" Mark asked, directing his question to Lisa. "About 5 minutes," she managed to say between breaths. Mark nodded, processing the information. He knew the hospital was at least a 20-minute drive from their current location. The situation was indeed urgent. As he stood there, Mark found himself at a crossroads. His training told him to follow protocol, issue a ticket, maybe even call for an ambulance. But something inside him hesitated. He thought about the recent tensions between the police and the community, especially with people of color. Mark's mind raced through various scenarios. What if he let them go and something happened? What if this was a ruse? But then again, what if it wasn't? The potential consequences of delaying a woman in labor weighed heavily on him. He looked at Jordan again, seeing not just a speeding driver, but a terrified soon-to-be father. Mark remembered the day his own son was born, the fear and excitement he had felt rushing to the hospital. Just as Mark was about to make a decision, the crackle of his radio broke the tense silence. "All units in the vicinity of Oak Street, we have reports of a speeding vehicle, possibly evading police. Black sedan, license plate starting with XDR. Mark's heart sank. He knew other officers would be arriving soon, potentially complicating the situation. The sound of distant sirens confirmed his fears. Jordan's eyes widened in panic. "Officer, please, we're not trying to evade anyone. We just need to get to the hospital." Mark knew he had to act fast. The approaching sirens meant he had mere moments to decide how to handle this situation. His next actions could either escalate tensions or potentially save a life. The weight of his badge, and all it represented in these turbulent times, had never felt heavier. Mark made a split-second decision. "Follow me," he said firmly to Jordan. "I'll escort you to the hospital." Jordan's relief was palpable as Mark rushed back to his patrol car. He radioed in, explaining the situation to dispatch and requesting a clear route to St. Mary's Hospital. As they sped through the streets, lights flashing and sirens blaring, Mark kept a close eye on Jordan's car in his rearview mirror. The gravity of his decision weighed on him. He'd bypassed standard procedure, but the urgency of the situation demanded it. Their high-speed journey came to an abrupt halt as they rounded a corner. A large crowd blocked the street ahead, holding signs and chanting. It was a protest against police brutality, ironically impeding their progress. Mark cursed under his breath. He hadn't anticipated this complication. The protesters, seeing the police lights, began to chant louder. Some moved to block the road more effectively. Pulling over, Mark got out of his car and approached Jordan's vehicle. "Stay here," he instructed. "I'll try to clear a path." As Mark walked towards the crowd, he could feel the tension in the air. Signs bearing slogans like "No Justice, No Peace," and "Black Lives Matter" were thrust in his direction. The chants grew louder as he approached. "Please," Mark shouted over the noise, "I need you to clear the road. We have a medical emergency." His words fell on deaf ears. Years of mistrust between the community and law enforcement had created a barrier that seemed insurmountable at that moment. Jordan, unable to contain his stress any longer, got out of his car. "My wife is having a baby," he yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. "Please, we need to get through." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people began to move aside, while others remained skeptical, viewing this as a potential police tactic. Mark found himself caught in the middle, both literally and figuratively. He understood the protesters' cause. Their anger and frustration were justified. But right now, a life hung in the balance. As the standoff continued, Mark could hear Lisa's cries of pain from the car. The situation was rapidly escalating, and he knew he had to find a solution fast. The choices he made in the next few moments would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Jordan and Lisa, but potentially for the entire community's relationship with law enforcement. Mark took a deep breath and made a decision. He turned to face the crowd, raised his hands in a gesture of peace, and spoke loudly but calmly. "I understand your anger. I know you have reasons to distrust the police. But right now, there's a woman in that car about to give birth. We need to get her to the hospital. Please let us through." His words seemed to have an effect. Some protesters began to move aside, creating a narrow path. However, just as Mark thought they'd made progress, he heard more sirens approaching. 2 more police cars arrived on the scene, lights flashing. The officers quickly exited their vehicles, hands on their holsters, clearly misreading the situation. "Stand down," Mark shouted to his colleagues. "This is not what you think it is." The new arrivals hesitated, confused by Mark's command. The crowd, agitated by the additional police presence, began to close ranks again. Mark found himself in the middle, physically placing himself between the protesters and the other officers. "Everyone, please calm down," he said, his voice strained but firm. "We have a medical emergency. We're not here to make arrests or stop the protest. We just need to get this woman to the hospital." One of the newly arrived officers, Davis, approached Mark. "Johnson, what's going on here? We got reports of a speeding vehicle and a crowd situation." Mark quickly explained the situation to Davis, all too aware of the precious time ticking away. Jordan stood nearby, his face a mask of fear and frustration. "We need to clear a path now," Mark insisted to Davis. "Can you help me convince the crowd?" Davis looked skeptical. "Are you sure about this, Johnson? It could be a trick." Mark felt a surge of anger at his colleague's suspicion. "It's not a trick. There's a woman in labor in that car. We're wasting time." The tension in the air was palpable. Protesters watched the exchange between the officers warily. Jordan paced back and forth, torn between staying with his wife and pleading with the crowd. Mark knew he had to act decisively. The next few moments would determine not just the fate of Jordan and Lisa, but potentially the relationship between the police and the community for years to come. He stepped forward, ready to make his stand. Mark made a bold move. He removed his badge and gun, handing them to a stunned Davis. "I'm going to help this couple get to the hospital," he announced loudly. This isn't about being a cop right now. It's about being human. His actions caught everyone off guard. The protesters murmured among themselves, and even Jordan looked surprised. Please, Mark addressed the crowd again. Let's show that we can come together when it really matters. Slowly, the crowd began to part. Mark quickly ushered Jordan back to his car and instructed him to follow closely. As they drove through the narrow path created by the protesters, Mark could hear cheers and words of encouragement. It was a surreal moment, a temporary truce in the midst of long-standing tensions. They arrived at St. Mary's Hospital in record time. Mark helped Jordan guide Lisa into the emergency room, where medical staff quickly took over. As Lisa was wheeled away for immediate care, Mark and Jordan found themselves alone in the waiting room. The adrenaline of the past hour began to wear off, leaving both men emotionally drained. Thank you, Jordan said quietly. I don't know what we would have done without your help. Mark nodded, suddenly feeling uncomfortable with the gratitude. I'm just glad we got here in time. An awkward silence fell between them. Mark realized this was probably the longest conversation he'd had with a young black man that didn't involve law enforcement duties. Can I ask you something? Jordan ventured after a moment. Why did you decide to help us? I mean, really help us? Mark considered the question carefully. I saw a man trying to get his wife to the hospital. That's it. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Jordan nodded slowly. You know, when you first pulled us over, I was terrified. I've had bad experiences with cops before. I'm sorry to hear that, Mark replied genuinely. I know there's a lot of work to be done to build trust. As they continued talking, Mark found himself sharing stories about his own life, his struggles, his family, his reasons for becoming a police officer. Jordan, in turn, opened up about his experiences as a young black man in America. Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse. Mr. Smith, your wife is ready to deliver. Would you like to come in? Jordan stood up, then hesitated. He turned to Mark. Would you mind waiting? I'd like you to meet the baby, if that's okay. Mark was taken aback by the request. He nodded, surprised to find himself feeling emotional. As Jordan disappeared down the hallway, Mark reflected on the unexpected connection they had formed. It was a small step, but perhaps it was the beginning of something important. Mark sat in the waiting room, his mind replaying the events of the day. The sound of hurried footsteps and beeping machines filled the air, a constant reminder of the life-and-death situations unfolding around him. Time seemed to crawl. Mark found himself pacing, feeling an unexpected sense of investment in the outcome. He thought about his own experience as a father, remembering the mix of fear and excitement he felt when his son was born. After what felt like hours, Jordan emerged from the delivery room. His face was a mix of exhaustion and pure joy. It's a girl, he announced, his voice cracking with emotion. They're both doing fine. Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him. Congratulations, he said, genuinely happy for the new father. Jordan hesitated for a moment, then asked, would you like to see her? Surprised by the invitation, Mark nodded and followed Jordan to the room where Lisa was resting with their newborn daughter. As they entered, Mark hung back, suddenly feeling like an intruder in this intimate family moment. Lisa looked up, recognition flickering in her tired eyes. You're the officer who helped us, she said softly. Mark nodded, unsure of what to say. His eyes were drawn to the tiny bundle in Lisa's arms. Would you like to hold her? Lisa offered, catching Mark off guard. With gentle encouragement from the new parents, Mark carefully took the newborn in his arms. As he looked down at the peaceful face of the baby girl, he felt a profound sense of the responsibility he carried as a police officer. This child, born amid chaos and tension, represented hope and new beginnings. Mark realized that his actions today would shape the world she would grow up in. What's her name? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We were thinking of calling her Hope, Jordan replied. It seemed fitting after everything that happened today. Mark smiled, carefully handing Hope back to her mother. It's perfect, he said, as he prepared to leave, allowing the new family their privacy. Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. The events of the day had reminded him why he became a police officer in the first place: to protect and serve, to make a positive difference in people's lives. He knew that bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community wouldn't be easy. But holding hope had reinforced his commitment to trying. As he left the hospital, Mark was already thinking about ways he could work to build trust and foster understanding in his community. In the weeks following Hope's birth, Mark found himself deeply affected by the experience. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more to address the issues plaguing his community. One afternoon, Mark approached his captain with a proposal. "I want to start a community outreach program," he said, laying out his ideas for building better relationships between the police and local residents. To his surprise, the captain was receptive. "It's worth a shot, Johnson, but you'll be doing this on your own time." "Understood." Mark nodded, grateful for the opportunity. He began by reaching out to Jordan, who agreed to help organize a town hall meeting. The first meeting was tense. Many community members were skeptical, some even hostile. But Mark persevered, listening to their concerns and grievances without becoming defensive. "We're here to listen and learn," he told the crowd. "We can't change the past, but we can work together for a better future." Over time, these meetings began to bear fruit. Mark implemented new training programs for officers, focusing on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. He also worked to establish a civilian review board to increase police accountability. Jordan became a key ally in these efforts. His story of Mark's assistance during Hope's birth became a powerful narrative of what could happen when police and community members saw each other as human beings first. Mark also began visiting local schools, talking to students about their rights and responsibilities, and trying to build positive relationships from an early age. He was often accompanied by other officers who shared his vision for change. It wasn't always easy. Mark faced resistance from some of his fellow officers who saw his efforts as a betrayal. There were setbacks and moments of frustration when progress seemed impossible. But there were also moments of hope, like when a young man approached Mark after a community basketball game and said, "You know, I used to be scared of cops, but you guys aren't so bad." Or when an elderly woman at a neighborhood watch meeting squeezed his hand and said, "Thank you for listening to us, officer. It means more than you know." As months passed, Mark began to see small but significant changes. Complaints against officers decreased. More community members were willing to cooperate with police investigations. The atmosphere at town hall meetings became less confrontational and more collaborative. Mark knew there was still a long way to go. Systemic changes took time, and trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt. But as he watched Hope take her first steps at her first birthday party, an event he was honored to be invited to, he felt a sense of optimism about the future. As Mark's community initiatives gained traction, he began to notice subtle changes in the precinct. Most officers were supportive or at least neutral about his efforts. However, a few seemed increasingly agitated by the new direction. One day, Mark overheard a heated conversation in the locker room. Officer Thompson, a veteran cop known for his hardline approach, was complaining loudly about the soft new policies. "We're here to enforce the law, not hold hands and sing Kumbaya," Thompson sneered. "Johnson's turning us into social workers." Mark chose to ignore the comment, but kept a closer eye on Thompson in the following weeks. He noticed the officers seemed to have an unusually high number of confrontational encounters, particularly with minority individuals. During a routine patrol, Mark and his partner responded to a disturbance call in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. When they arrived, they found Thompson already on the scene, aggressively questioning a group of young men. Mark intervened, de-escalating the situation. Later, he confronted Thompson about his behavior. "You were out of line back there," Mark said firmly. Thompson scoffed. "You weren't there from the beginning. Those punks were resisting." Unsettled by the incident, Mark decided to dig deeper. He discreetly began reviewing Thompson's arrest records and body cam footage. What he found disturbed him: a pattern of excessive force and racial profiling. Gathering his evidence, Mark requested a meeting with the captain. He laid out his concerns, presenting the data he'd collected. The captain listened gravely. "These are serious allegations, Johnson. Are you sure you want to pursue this?" Thompson has friends in high places. Mark nodded, resolute. "It's the right thing to do, sir." As he left the captain's office, Mark felt a mix of determination and apprehension. He knew that by taking on Thompson, he was potentially making powerful enemies within the force. His fears were confirmed the next day when he found his locker vandalized, the word snitch spray-painted across it. Anonymous threats began appearing on his desk. Despite the intimidation, Mark pressed on with the investigation. He reached out to community members for additional testimonies, building a solid case against Thompson. As pressure mounted, Thompson's behavior became increasingly erratic. During a tense standoff at a protest, Mark witnessed Thompson raise his baton against an unarmed demonstrator. Without hesitation, Mark stepped in, physically restraining his fellow officer. The incident was caught on multiple cameras, becoming a flashpoint in the ongoing debate about police conduct. Mark knew that his actions had irreversibly set him on a collision course with the old guard of the police force. The coming days would test his resolve and potentially change the department forever. In the wake of the protest incident, Mark found himself at the center of a departmental storm. His actions against Thompson had drawn a clear line between those who supported reform and those who resisted it. Determined to see the investigation through, Mark doubled down on his efforts. He spent late nights poring over records, cross-referencing complaints, and building a comprehensive case against Thompson. One evening, as Mark was leaving the precinct, Jordan approached him in the parking lot. "I heard what's been going on," Jordan said, concern evident in his voice. "Some of my friends have stories about Thompson. They're willing to come forward if it'll help." Mark nodded gratefully. "That can make a big difference. But are they sure? It's not without risk." Jordan's expression hardened. "They know, but they're tired of being afraid. Your actions have given them hope." Over the next few weeks, Mark worked tirelessly, gathering testimonies from community members and fellow officers alike. Each account painted a damning picture of Thompson's misconduct. As the investigation progressed, the pressure on Mark intensified. Anonymous threats escalated to vandalism of his personal vehicle. Rumors circulated about his integrity, attempting to discredit him. One night, as Mark was working late at the precinct, Thompson confronted him directly. "You're making a big mistake, Johnson," Thompson growled, invading Mark's personal space. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Mark stood his ground. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Thompson. A corrupt cop who's a disgrace to the badge." Thompson's face contorted with rage. He shoved Mark hard, sending him stumbling backward. "You'll regret this," Thompson snarled before storming off. Shaken but undeterred, Mark reported the incident to the captain. The tension in the department was reaching a boiling point. The following day, Mark received an unexpected call from a police detective in a neighboring city. "Officer Johnson, I have some information about Thompson you might find interesting. Can we meet?" Mark agreed, his instincts telling him this could be the breakthrough he needed. As he drove to the meeting point, a secluded park on the outskirts of town, Mark couldn't shake a feeling of unease. He parked his car and scanned the area. The park was eerily quiet. As he stepped out of his vehicle, Mark heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Thompson emerging from the shadows, a menacing grin on his face. "Looks like your friend couldn't make it, Johnson," Thompson sneered. "But don't worry, I'm here to finish our little chat." Mark realized he'd walked into a trap. As Thompson advanced, Mark knew the confrontation he'd been anticipating had finally arrived. The outcome of this encounter would have far-reaching consequences for both of them and the entire department. Mark's hand instinctively moved towards his holster, but he stopped himself. He knew escalating to violence would only play into Thompson's hands. "Think carefully about your next move, Thompson," Mark said, his voice steady despite the tension. "This ends now, one way or another." Thompson laughed coldly. "You're right about that. I'm going to teach you what happens to cops who don't know their place." As Thompson stepped closer, Mark made a split-second decision. He reached into his pocket and pressed the record button on his phone. "Before you do anything stupid," Mark said, "there's something you should know. I was wearing a wire during our last encounter at the precinct. Internal affairs is everything." Thompson's face paled. "You're bluffing," he snarled, but doubt crept into his voice. Mark pressed on. "It's over, Thompson. The evidence against you is overwhelming. But right now you have a choice. You can come clean, tell the truth about everything, or you can make things worse for yourself." For a moment, Thompson seemed to deflate. Then unexpectedly, he began to laugh. "You don't get it, do you, Johnson? It's not just me. There are others higher up. They'll never let this see the light of day. Then let's shine a light on all of it." Mark replied. "Help me clean up the department. It's the only way forward." Thompson's laughter faded. He looked at Mark with a mix of anger and something that might have been respect. "You really believe you can change things, don't you?" "I have to try," Mark said simply. There was a long pause. Then Thompson sighed heavily. "All right, Johnson. You win. But you better be ready for what's coming. This goes deeper than you know." Over the next hour, Thompson confessed everything. Mark recorded it all, his mind reeling at the extent of the corruption Thompson revealed. As dawn broke, Mark drove back to the precinct, the weight of Thompson's confession heavy on his shoulders. He knew that what he was about to do would send shockwaves through the entire police force. Mark walked into the captain's office, placed his phone on the desk, and played the recording. The captain listened in stunned silence. When it was over, the captain looked at Mark with a mix of admiration and trepidation. "You've opened Pandora's box, Johnson. Are you prepared for what comes next?" Mark nodded resolutely. "Whatever it takes to make this right, sir. We owe it to the community we swore to protect and serve." As he left the office, Mark felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, anxiety, determination. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about the future of policing in his community. The story of a routine traffic stop had led to a moment that could transform the entire department. As Mark stepped out into the morning sun, he was ready to face whatever came next, committed to the path of justice and reform he had chosen.